My name is John Lightbody Jr. I've lived in Stoddard for most of my life.
I'm Joyce Williams. I've lived in Stoddard all my life until I moved out, but I was born in Stoddard, and so was my family.
Oh, I'm the oldest. I'm Judy Walton, Judy Ripley Walton.
I am Cindy Kingsbury Walliger. My father is her mother's brother.
I'm Sally Ripley, and I grew up coming to the lake in the summertime. And I finally moved up to the lake in 1972 when I built my house, was ready to move into in 73, and I've been there ever since.
I'm Carol Clark, and my maiden name was Rindu when I moved to Stoddard in 1964, and been there for quite some time now. I have moved away a little bit, 6.5 years to Marlow, but majority of my adult life I've lived in Stoddard.
I'm Linda Stevenson, Sandy Davis, Laura Phillips.
All right, I'm Richard Whitney, and I live on Chalet Drive in Stoddard.
My name's Tom Abert. My connection goes back to the 60s. I grew up in Stoddard mostly. Moved there full-time when I was 6 from New York City. Prior to that, my mother and I had been going back and forth between New York and Stoddard.
I'm Donald Miller. I live in Rochester, New York. I'm 81 years old, and I was a summer resident of Stoddard in the 50s and early 60s.
I am Alan Rumrill, and I have been a resident of Stoddard all my life.
You just answered the question. How long have you lived in Stoddard, though? You can't elaborate.
I have lived in Stoddard all my life because my family has been there since 1770. So my mother's family arrived in Stoddard 2 years after the town was settled. So we've been there for generations and generations.
Came over in 1700. And many generations owned our home, the McClure home, and we're near Granite Lake, end of the town, as opposed to Stoddard Center. And we've had a lot of history in the town, people, family involved, and my parents, especially my grandparents, and the town was a big thing, much smaller than it is now.
And my father left New Hampshire and moved to Minnesota, which is where I was raised. So I would come back to Granite Lake to visit my grandfather and my grandmother, and then eventually my parents moved back to the lake, and then I would visit them and bring my children here. So Granite Lake's been in our family a long time.
My father worked on Long Island, so we went up to Stoddard as soon as school was out and stayed until right before Labor Day. And that was because my father didn't. Well, he never worked in New Hampshire while I was born. When I was before I was born, he worked in Dublin. He was a school teacher in Dublin and principal of that school, which is how we got the property. It was through one of the people he'd worked with. So, but we still go up to Stoddard occasionally. In the summer, probably we'll go up more if the new cell tower goes in and we have internet access. So,
I was 12. It was in January of 1964. And I moved from Wilton, New Hampshire. My parents did. My dad used to manage Whiting Farms, which was 4 farms, dairy cattle. And they sold and auctioned everything off. So my dad got a job at Pitcher Mountain Farm in Stoddard, which was beef cattle at the time, Scotch Highlanders. And had no idea where Stoddard was, what Stoddard, I had no idea. and very active in Wilton. I was in Girl Scouts and the youth group at church. I was really active. Moved to Stoddard. I don't remember the exact population, but I know it was under 400. And driving through town, I will never forget, looking like for the town, asking my mother where the downtown is. She said, "This is the town," as we're driving through town.
My family were farmers when they first arrived, my family members. So they were there for agricultural purposes, to farm the land and support their families. They never really got involved in industry, but they all stayed on the various farms as they intermarried with new settlers in the town.
Our grandfather purchased a great big rambling cottage, which used to be a fishing retreat, or people used to come up and stay there and go fishing. Has a great big kitchen, great big dining room with a huge table, nice living room, and then it has a hall with 8 bedrooms, 4 on each side down the hall. So the people who came here to fish would have their own little rooms and then common areas.
And then at the end, they must have tacked the bathroom on when plumbing came in. Probably had an outhouse at the end before that.
So when we came and I was a child, we stayed in that house. We stayed with my grandparents. So I had the second room on the left, and each room had 2 small twin beds, and in the corner was a sink with a little running water and a little curtain. And then on the other side, there were like 4 hooks. It was nothing, not really a closet. So I think about the men coming to fish, they didn't have a lot of amenities.
Stoddard struck me as one of the most beautiful places that I could imagine. And it was color season, and we hiked all around the pond and carrying the young children. And it was totally enjoyable. We had a delicious European meal and spent the evening in front of the fireplace, just chatting and having good companionship. And that weekend really stands out. I fell in love with this place. That's the truth. Well, when we were leaving, Otto had said, "You know, we usually take all of July as our vacation and don't even use this in August. Wouldn't you like to come here and spend a week just with your family?" And it was a marvelous invitation. After that, we took them up, and for 6 years we came every August for that week, and it became our summer home. Then unfortunately, Otto lost his vision. And he had said to me, I don't want to stay here because it's so beautiful, and if I can't see it, I just don't want to stay here.
And in 1977, we bought Stoddard because Liesl and Otto decided it was time for them to pass it on, and they felt we would be stewards for the property. We came up to Stoddard in 1977, the day after Christmas, and it was full of snow. We parked at the church and we put our clothes and our food on a toboggan and came in. The road was not plowed, so we walked up the hill and down the hill and up the hill again, and it was magnificent. It was like a fairyland. The trees only had their bark, no leaves, but it was beautiful.
I grew up spending summers on Granite Lake and came back regularly with my family ever since then. And I live there permanently now.
But my childhood was so involved with the war. I think that's what I remember the most. But the war left memories. I think I'm still marked by the war. I'm fascinated by all things World War II because I was 6 when it began. I remember the call my mother got from Mrs. Richardson, and said that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and of course it meant nothing to me, but my mother was horrified. And from then on, was very aware of things. I do recall, as you heard things on the radio and saw them in the papers, maybe on a newsreel or something, about things going on in the war, I developed this fear of the Japanese soldiers coming through the woods with bayonets, and where would I hide in the house? So those types of effects. I still have some of my rationing stamps, because everybody got a book for ration stamps for food, for certain foods that were rationed: butter, meat, sugar, flour, all of those things. And we each had a ration book for that. Also had a ration book for gasoline. You only got so much gasoline each month, and so you made your trips. But this, of course, was in the early 40s. And my family was chosen to be airplane watchers. We were, I think they were all over the place, people who lived on a hill like we did. So we were to record any airplane that we saw. And I have the manual still of all the airplanes that the Japanese had and all the airplanes that the Germans had. We were supposed to memorize them. You know, I'm 8. And know any airplane that went over and record it, and each week you would have to report that. And at the end of that, we each got a medal for it. But we thought that was quite exciting as well. I wish I could say that I knew how other people were affected by it, but I don't think the effect was great, other than individual people with deprivation of gasoline and products. But that was a moment in time when the whole world came together, and everybody, you saved your tin, you saved your paper, everything was recycled. My Aunt Lucy would call my mother she heard that First National Stores had got sugar and butter in. Well, we better make a trip to Keene. So they would, go together, save gas, and use their stamps. You could have all the money you wanted, but if you didn't have stamps, you couldn't buy the butter, the sugar, the flour, the meat. And so that was a big deal. But I don't remember ever being deprived of anything, because my mother was a farm woman. She knew how to make something out of nothing, and we were never deprived. Eventually, we were supposed to put the black curtains on the windows, and my mother rebelled. She didn't want to do that. She finally did, but you're supposed to have blackout at night, I remember VJ Day the most. By that time, VE Day I don't remember as much as I do VJ Day, because there was a big celebration in Keene, and I remember seeing that. Of course, I was 10, and my sisters were part of that, and the streets of Keene were just packed with people celebrating the end of the war. And it was heady times, because it meant everything would change again. You're going to be able to buy gas, you're going to be able to throw away the stamps, and ushering in a whole new era. And all of the soldiers would be coming home.
Okay, my name is Terry McMahon, and I'd like to talk to you about my recollections of going to school here in Stoddard back in the 1940s. I went to grade school in Stoddard in the 40s. At that time, it was a one-room schoolhouse with one teacher who taught about 24 pupils in 8 grades. Actually, there were 4 rooms if you include the 2 entrances, one for the boys and one for the girls, and the book room that was in between them. The back 2/3 of the building was the classroom. at the front of which was the teacher's desk, the wood stove that heated the building, and a small table and chairs for the first graders. The rest of the room held rows of bolted down desks for the students. There was a 5-gallon can of drinking water in a back corner, as the building had no running water. The outhouse was accessed through a door at the back wall and was connected to the schoolhouse by a lattice-work breezeway. The outhouse itself was divided into 2 rooms, one for the boys and one for the girls.
In the 1800s, there were 11 schoolhouses in Stoddard because the kids all walked to school and the population was much larger. By the time I arrived at elementary school in 1963, there was just the one school with the 30 students. Our school bus was a Ford station wagon, so you can see there weren't that many pupils to transport to school. We were all in one room in an 1850 building. So the schoolhouse had been built in 1850, but here we were 110 years later still using the same structure. So it looked like an 1850 school building.
A lot of good memories of school have started. Because we had so many grades in one room, you kind of grew up with people older than you and people younger than you.
I was an energetic child, extremely curious, and it's hard when it's a one-room schoolhouse with one teacher, one teacher's aide, because she's got 6 grades to be teaching, and kind of trading things off, and everyone's in the group.
There was no ability to have some special ed teacher. The special ed teachers were the older kids who were teaching reading and arithmetic to the younger kids.
And by the time you got to be in the 8th grade, we were giving the reading lessons to the younger people. And by that time, it had what we call a furnace room. We had a real furnace, and we older girls were allowed to go in the furnace room once in a while and put the books away and sort the materials and gossip.
So it really was a wonderful experience in the one-room school. I didn't think of it much at the time, but later on I realized how important that was in my development, because there you were with kids from 6 grades. You could complete your own work and then move to the next grade level whenever you got there. You could work at your own pace, and one thing that was very useful for me was being able to shut out all of the noise and commotion around me so I could focus on my work as all the other grades worked with the teacher and did reading lessons and so forth. So I think that helped me later in life to shut out surrounding noise and focus on my work.
I still have dreams about going there. And it was a conglomerate of many different types of people as well. But I have my papers still, some of them. My arithmetic papers, back when we called it arithmetic, we had to know our stuff back then. And by grade 3, I realized that I had to have glasses. Back then, somebody would come and examine you, an eye test, and so they would put the eye chart on the wall in the front of the room, and you would be called up one by one to read the chart. Couldn't read a thing. Totally humiliated. And realized I need glasses from then on. However, I would not wear my glasses except in class. And I don't think I ever wore my glasses until I was about 21. I would take them off and pretend, they're just there for looks.
So by the time I was in, 3rd or 4th grade, I remember just being bored out of my skull and going to the teacher, Mrs. Lane, and asking her if there was something I could read, because I had finished the textbook all the way through to the end, and it was like December. And she, I'll never forget this look on her face. There was a semi-panic look. I mean, it's one of these things you recognize in retrospect. At the time, you don't. You're a kid. You're stupid. But in retrospect, because I remember it visually, there was this look of panic, exasperation, and then calm that went across her eyes. And she thought, well, why don't you go to the back room, which was also the furnace room, and they had all the old textbooks stored in there. Going back, gosh, I mean, there were textbooks back there from the early 1900s. So she sent me back there, said, why don't you just go explore and see what you can find and read it. And I had an absolutely divine time for several years. As soon as I got all my work done for the year, I would go back there and spend the last half of the year just back reading the old textbook.
Recess was, of course, the most wonderful time when you go out and play with all your friends, not just in the field, but in the woods, over the stone walls, and on the playground. And one thing that we did when I got a little to the higher grades in school was to explore under the church, which stood next door to the school. And I'm sure the teachers wouldn't have approved that. There was a little crawl space under there, and we wandered around under this 1836 church building on the rocks and in the mud, and there was an opening up under the stairs of the inside the church. So that was another interesting experience.
Recess and so forth was always a big deal. The school was right on 123, and it would be a terrible place to have a school today with the traffic that's coming down Pitcher Mountain and so forth. But I can remember the Stoddard School had no insulation whatsoever to speak of, and there was icicles on that coming off the roof that they'd break off, and you could get pieces big enough to sit on and then slide down the driveway to 123. That was cool.
We had recess out there where we played softball, I guess it was, which I didn't want to do because I took my glasses off. God forbid I be seen with my glasses on. Couldn't see anything. Did get hit with a ball in the nose once, which accounts for my nose. And we played kick the can, we played keep away, we played all these games outside, but we had to go outside during recess. And on the other side of the school where the swing set eventually went, I don't think that was there in my time. I know it wasn't. Up behind there in the woods, we were forbidden to go there. But there was a felled tree, a log, that was sort of hollowed out and sort of a lot of bushes and trees around it. So it was sort of like a little hut. Well, we thought that was big stuff, and we would sneak off there during recess and try not to get caught, because we weren't allowed there. We thought we were hot stuff.
Schoolhouse was located next to the church at the site now occupied by a collection box for donated clothing, as the school itself burned down in 1979.
I couldn't believe it, the truth, I mean, wow. I thought it would always be there, kind of thing. It sat beside the church, and it was neat. It was a nice exposure and so forth. I just couldn't believe it burned down.
Shock, surprise, sadness. It was such an icon.
There was a momentary sadness, and I remember going by, driving by it, and looking at the site and thinking about the time I spent in that boiler room where the fire started, reading all those old textbooks, and they were all toast, they were all ashes. So, I mean, it was sad. It was an historical building. A lot of children's lives passed through it.
When I started elementary school in Stoddard in the 1960s, there were only about 150 people living in the entire town. And it's one of the largest towns. It is the second largest town in Cheshire County. So there weren't very many people per square mile. So we knew essentially everyone in the community, and were friends and friendly with all of the people. And people got involved in the community because there were so few people there that they all had to help with the town government and the nonprofit organizations and the church. We also, because there were so few people, there was a lot of natural area where the farms had been abandoned and all the mills had been abandoned when those people had left town. That meant we could wander anywhere. So as the kids in the neighborhood, we would go wandering in the woods and play in the fields and in the lakes that were there. So it really was a wonderful place to grow up because you could spend your whole day outside.
I spent a lot of time in the woods, hiking, exploring, looking at the old sawmills and old cellar holes and that kind of stuff. I still live in the same area that I played in as a kid. And just to see the difference in how tall trees have gotten and how areas have grown in and that kind of stuff.
I appreciate it a lot more now than when I was a kid, because as a kid and a preteen and a teen, I felt isolated, as there were no real near neighbors to where we were. You had to go somewhere to be with people.
But there wasn't a whole lot for kids to do. You found stuff to do on your own, a lot more than today.
Although we had a chunk of land on Granite Lake, so we made friends with people on Granite Lake and swimming there. My mother could swim from our shore to the island, which I thought was nuts. But the island was the place where we all went.
All I can say one more thing is that I happened to meet a wonderful man who grew up on a lake in Wisconsin. So he likes Granite Lake even better than he liked his lake in Wisconsin.
That's nice.
Yeah. So
we have one of the cleanest lakes in New Hampshire. In fact, we have native lake trout, and they're very particular where they spawn.
Nature is extremely important to Stoddard, to the residents and to those who visit as well, to enjoy the outdoors and the natural features. When I was growing up, as I mentioned, we spent a great deal of time outdoors, and you were simply surrounded by nature. You could go hiking all day long without your parents worrying about anything happening to you because there were so few people. We could go berry picking and hiking up on the high hills behind Granite Lake. But during my lifetime, much of that land has now been conserved as open space with being available for public use as well. So I don't know that there was any actually permanently preserved land when I was born. But now more than, well, about 2/3 of Stoddard's land area is permanently preserved and conserved by state and local conservation groups and by the private landowners as well. They have donated or sold conservation easements to those nonprofit groups that I just mentioned. So now there's 2/3 of the town that is conserved. So you are indeed completely surrounded by nature.
My name is Paul Fiandella. My parents bought property in Highland Lake in 1967. So I came to Stoddard in 1967. My parents always had an interest in nature. We had gone on various trips for vacation to northern New England, and you know, as a child, I would look forward to my vacation in the woods. So my parents wanted a place where it was really natural, where there was wild, where there was still a lot of animals that you could see, and the air was clean. And Stoddard was the place. And Highland Lake in those days was not very expensive to buy an old camp on Highland Lake. In 1968, after a period in which I had dropped out of college, I decided to come up here and live up here in Stoddard. So I moved to Stoddard in '68 in the fall. In 1969, I wrote an article about the White Mountains, hiking in the White Mountains, and the conclusion of the article was, if you were searching for nature, you could find it in New Hampshire in your own backyard. Stoddard had a greater diversity of wildlife and environmental and ecological niches than I observed in the White Mountains, which was inundated with people and recreational activities. So when you came back to Stoddard, it was quiet, nature reigned, and you sort of had to fit in. I eventually did meet Betty. The way I met her is one day I was bicycling up her road and I saw this car, and I came up past the car and I stopped, and Betty got out of the car and said, "Young man, what are you doing on my property?" Which of course, what was I doing on her property? So my answer was, "Ma'am, what are you doing in a Mercedes-Benz in the middle of the woods?" She thought that was hysterically funny. And from that point on, we had a pretty good relationship. Basically, we discussed wildlife. Betty grew up in a very wealthy family in New York and New Jersey. Her mother was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. Her mother had given the property for Monmouth State College to the state of New Jersey. So there was a lot of philanthropy in the family. But this was old money that was made in the early 19th century, you know, in the industrialization phase of the American economy. Betty grew up with robber barons. So we had something in common because I had been all over her property. And basically I knew as much as anybody could know from just observation. I wasn't trained as a naturalist, but I could see that there was a diversity of habitats. We discussed a wildlife refuge because Betty owned around 3,400 acres. And this was an enormous piece of property. As we were discussing wildlife refuges, Betty told me about Thurston Williams' lawsuit. Williams, who was building this lake development, if you want to call it a lake, it was like maybe a pond development, was trying to get access over her property to a piece of his property. He had succeeded in actually winning this attempt to get access over her roads. And to me, it seemed, you know, the courts made a mistake because I had been through the town records, and the town records showed that all of the roads that Betty had actually created had been discontinued in the 1800s. They no longer existed. So he didn't have any right to use the discontinued roads. And basically, this came as a big piece of news to everybody at the time because it had never been brought up in the original suit. So I said to Betty, since the roads have been discontinued, why don't you go back to your attorneys and tell them to appeal this case? So Betty decided to appeal. In 1976, she won the suit. Why is this case important to Stoddard, to the future? I think something like 70% of Stoddard is now in a permanent conservation easement or current use. The town is really well situated for the future in terms of preservation.
Lucky to live where we live. We have wildlife, moose, bear, deer all the time. And everywhere you go, there's something to see. Whether it's a huge boulder on top of a hill like Stoddard Rocks, different times of year on a lake with different as the seasons go by and the foliage and all that kind of stuff. There's always, for me, there was always a lot to do. There was never enough time in the day to do things that you would like to do.
What I always liked about Stoddard was the wildness. And it's still there. And that's still there. I mean, because of the amount of land that's in those various trusts, most of the wild areas have not been disturbed.
The town of Stoddard has more conserved land than any other town in the state of New Hampshire. And the people in Stoddard are nature lovers, and we're nature lovers. We want to be part of that group of people. So moving here is the best thing we ever did, by far.
I can walk out the back door of my house and I can walk all day on open, public, conserved land, which has been a big boon for the town. It's good for for the local residents because it allows them to escape into the wild and sort of recharge their batteries without thinking about what goes on every day in their lives. But it's also been good by drawing in visitors from outside of the community. Because of all this conservation land, they come to visit those 8 or 10 lakes and ponds in the town, and they can go hiking and blueberry picking and just exploring nature, getting back to nature and trying to interact with the wildlife and seeing what's out there. So it really has been very important to the townspeople and to the region, I think, to allow this open space for people to go and recharge.
But my favorite memories are my parents hiking in the woods up in Stoddard and having a picnic in October and getting caught in a snowstorm. That was a lot of fun. Also, I had invited some friends up, to come up to see what the woods was all about. They were from New Zealand, which you would think of as a pretty wild place. And Stoddard was so wild for them, they were afraid to go in the lake. It was very strange. I couldn't understand it at all.
As to Stoddard Center, I didn't get out into the woods very much. Pitcher Mountain, yes. Pitcher Mountain, we would go up and visit the lookout tower, where old Fred Jennings was the lookout tower fellow, and just climbing up there was an adventure into that lookout tower where he tried to spot any forest fire, and also picking blueberries on Pitcher Mountain. It was nice up there because you could drive up almost to the top. I don't know if you can anymore. I don't know how far you can drive anymore. The last time I drove up there, I said, never again, my car is being killed. But you get to the very top and the blueberries were out of this world.
Well, in the winter we did, sliding, ice skating. Summertime, my mother would take us to Marlow, because we were on Pitcher Mountain, we did a lot in Marlow. My mother always shopped at the Marlow grocery store, and I got to know people there, but we went swimming over on Nashua Pond, in the town there. Now they don't, but back then there was a town beach. And so just went swimming, but also living on the farm. We worked on the farm some. Like, one of the jobs I most dreaded was picking rocks. But, we just went out there and they paid us, 25 cents an hour, whatever. My dad would pay us to go out there, 50 cents an hour, whatever, and help. And as did Wally Weaver, who worked with my dad. His sons did, and us, my brother and I, and sometimes my older sister. But we did that, we hayed, and my brother and I just entertained ourselves. We walked a lot up to Pitcher Mountain, up to the tower. We went blueberry picking with my dad, because the blueberries are right there up behind the pasture.
And Pitcher Mountain is a fabulous mountain, probably the easiest hike of any mountain anywhere for one of the very best views. I highly recommend it. It's an easy hike, anybody can do it. And I've hiked that many times. I painted on Pitcher Mountain, and the ranch with the longhorn steers, and now they're bison there. That whole area is just extraordinarily beautiful.
My brother and I did, like I said, walked a lot up to like the tower and out to the blueberry field up on Pitcher Mountain. I've always loved to be outdoors. I love gardening. I garden. I'm not any master gardener, but I love to be out. My dad was a big gardener. I always helped him, and he had a huge vegetable garden and flower bed, and I always helped that. But as an adult, like my husband and I, my husband worked for Indoor Forest for many years, and of course knows a lot of the trails and took care of them on Pitcher Mountain. But I truly enjoy, we have a view where we live now of Island Pond, and I absolutely love that we have the lakes and the ponds and nature around us, and large tracts of protected property, trails to hike, I love that, and that's one of the beauties of living in Stoddard.
The fire tower that we're talking about that's there now was the second one, because the original one burned down in 1941 in the Stoddard Marlow fire.
The Marlow Forest Fire did of 1941, because the hurricane of 1938 brought about that fire, as you know. I don't remember the hurricane of 38, but I remember the fire of Marlow Fire in 1941 because I was 6. My father was part of the fire department, the fire chief. And the fire burned for days, and every day and night the men were out there fighting fires, including him. My mother and the other women every day were making sandwiches and coffee and taking it to the men. And every night could look out over the horizon and see a red sky, which was kind of frightening, and it gave me a healthy fear of fire. A lot, because they were so afraid that it was going to keep coming closer into Stoddard. The house I was telling you about earlier that my father remodeled for the Richardsons, Swain was their name at the time, and Richardsons, on the hill on King Street. They hosed down that house and barn a lot because they thought the direct path of the fire was coming across the hills towards that house. And so people in Stoddard were very, very nervous about that. And everybody pitched in, of course, to help. Yeah, scary.
Okay. It came all the way from Stoddard, and it came down, started coming down the hill pretty well, and unfortunately it started to snow. It was the end of April, and it burned half a mile and a good amount of forest in between. Luckily it stopped, but could have been the end of Stoddard too.
It's just the biggest difference in Stoddard today than then is the number of people that live there and the type of people that live there.
Definitely the population. And when we first started coming up there, especially when we were teenagers, we were like, what do we do here? There's nothing much to do, so you did have to create and do your own thing at that time. But it was definitely more, when you would look out or across the lake, there would not be any, there's only like one cottage, I think, right?
Yeah, we didn't, when we first came, we never saw anybody.
Right.
There was nobody, there was one cottage across the lake and that was all. And there was one out our road, which you couldn't see, but we would see the man row in his rowboat. But basically, we were there by ourselves for a long time. And then the more building, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, this is getting quite populated. And it used to be, there weren't many boats on the lake either, and now there's a lot of boats. It used to be more rowboats or canoes, and now there are a lot more speedboats, jet skis.
We didn't have any of that.
Visually, you wouldn't know the difference because driving through the town, all you saw was Mill Village and Stoddard Center up by the church.
There's just like Stoddard Center, still a lot of the way it was when I think of that often driving through town. But it has changed, obviously with Hidden Lake development. A lot more population now. I mean, I think we're up around 1,300, up over 1,200 anyway, 1,300.
And that really hadn't changed. What had changed was the development of all of the places back off the road, like Hidden Lake or the addition of more places around Center Pond, or not Center Pond, but Island Pond. And so the mix of people had changed. When I was growing up, it was a few families who were what was left of a town that before the Civil War had been about 1,200 people. At the time I was growing up, wasn't much over 100. So it was a little town where everybody knew each other and formed very much of a community because it was sort of an isolated community. Whatever happened in here was a result of what the folks did. Now it's become much more like a more rural suburb sort of thing.
It used to be that everybody knew everybody else, but it isn't that way anymore. So that's one of the major changes in traffic. Kay and I had horses for 40 some odd years, and we'd ride carriage around town and so forth, and we actually went down Route 9 several times. Today, there's so much traffic on Route 9, I wouldn't want to take a horse and carriage out there, no. And that's, to see the traffic, you have to stop at the stop sign and wait for cars to go by. It was never like that, you know. So that's probably the biggest change, is the number of people and the traffic that has to go through town.
I was quite impressed when I came back by the mid-90s how exploding the area was. And also there were a lot of people who had moved in, and it was interesting.
Well, even on our Chalet Drive, I think we have at least 3 new houses built. We've been there 30 years, at least 3 new houses are there. COVID, of course, that people wanted to get out of the big cities, get away from the disease and the pandemic. And Stoddard was a lovely refuge. It's not that far from Boston. Stoddard is basically almost the exact center of New England. And you know, within 3 or 4 hours you can go almost any place in New England. In New York, Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, Hartford, White Mountains, Maine. It's centrally located, and that's also a great feature.
And the automobile is really what allowed Stoddard to survive, because the population got down to 113 people in 1930. And there was some question as to whether the town would survive at all. But then the automobile was developed and people could drive to those small towns, enjoy the many lakes that Stoddard has and the natural beauty. But then it also, as the quality of autos improved, it allowed people to drive to work every day. So they could buy some of those old abandoned farmhouses or build new homes in the small towns that were very enjoyable to live in, not at all hectic like the city, and drive to the larger towns and cities to work. So that helped Stoddard to survive and begin to thrive once again.
So the town, you know, has grown, and you may not notice it as much as others who've lived there a while, but it's changed, but a lot of it hasn't. We still have the lakes and the protected property, and obviously more people, so there's sometimes more controversy with things.
Well, of course, it's still kind of isolated from any city. You've got to go 10, 15 miles to reach the city part. I think it keeps its rural character very nice.
In the ways it stayed the same, from my recollection, the road and the buildings on the road and the whole town community, it looks the same. There aren't a whole lot of new buildings or anything, so it still feels the same.
Yeah, there's a lot of old buildings, whether they're now residences or the town hall, the library, different places like that are using those buildings.
Well, I will say I've always felt a certain friendliness with the neighbors and with the Stoddard residents, and I think it is the same in the town meeting. and the town government, which are all things that I really love. And that I would like to stay much of the same.
Ever since I've lived in Stoddard, the people are very caring of one another and look out for each other. And Stoddard's really spread out with South Stoddard down at Granite Lake. Then we have the village, South Stoddard down 123 south to Hancock. And it goes, over Pitcher Mountain to Marlow. I mean, it's very spread out. But whenever there's been a need or anyone in town needs something, or there's like the ice storm when we had to open up the school, people had to go up there. People just came together and made food and brought it up, and they care about their neighbors. There can be a controversy, and we've had a couple that have been pretty bad, but the town comes together for things like that.
When all is said and done, it still has a lot of the same characteristics. It's largely rural. There's lots of trails for various activities, hunting, hiking, camping, and the like.
Well, it still is very, very special in every way. We adore the woods because it does everything that I could possibly hope for. We came up here when my husband had retired. I would bring all the Thanksgiving fixings, and we would have Thanksgivings up here. Fortunately, they were delightful. We could be outside, and the leaves were gone, but Stoddard was still as perfect as ever.
But really, the town keeps its New England historic heritage intact as when I was a child. Very little has changed in the villages. There are a couple of villages in Stoddard, and they look pretty much as they did when I was growing up. So you have the New England heritage being preserved, and that draws visitors as well who want, heritage tourists who want to see what old-time New England was like. And Stoddard is ideal for that because it hasn't changed much in the last 150 years.
It's so unique. You'll never find a place like this again. And I'm just so grateful to be here. It's peaceful. It's peaceful. You're right in nature. You're within the forest perimeter. It's quiet 95% of the time, except when, in the summer you can hear the boats on the lake in the distance, or on weekends sometimes fireworks. But other than that, it's peaceful. And after a while, hearing the wind and the birds is almost nicer and more profound than even listening to music, the music of nature.
Just a love for the area more than anything. Like I say, I grew up there, and as a kid played in the same area that we live now. And being quaint and small and having some control over the town, by voting on certain articles or whatever. And we like where we are.
I've remained a resident for a few reasons. First of all, because it is not like living in the city, and having grown up surrounded by nature, I still want to have that experience. And I know the area so well. Because my family has been there so long, I really have a sense of place and a close connection with the community and the people who are there and the natural landscape and surrounding in the community. So I want to be in really a town that I have come to love because of my family's interest in history and my own.
I see that I will, as long as I'm able, and my family.
I was going to say, and I foresee the next generations continuing it.
Right. My daughter is interested in our place, and her two sons are, and my son comes back from Texas every year to be there. So it definitely holds memories for everybody, I think.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, as long as we can.
Well, I will, especially, and I'm hoping our grandchildren continue to use our cabins. They're old enough now. One has a girlfriend who's really fallen in love with Granite Lake. So I think, yes, I don't know why. We're fifth generation now, really, on the lake in Stoddard. And that says a lot about its draw. Yeah, it's just, there's something wonderful about the area.
I have no intention of moving until I have no choice. Hopefully I will be here for 10, 20 more years at least, hopefully, and physically able to stay here. God forbid I have an illness where I have to sell and move out. So be it, but I intend to be here. I hope to die here. I hope to be buried, at least my ashes are spread on the property. I have no intention of moving whatsoever.
But the town itself, I've grown to respect more over the years because it seems now to have a little bit of the best of all. I think with its variety of people, it's, as we call them, the newcomers. But in our family, there's been McClures since 1700. And now that my father had no sons, the name has died because I married a Williams. So that's why the home is owned by a Williams now, and my sons are named Williams. But there's no more McClures in Stoddard, so that's a big transition.
I'm comfortable here, although I'm comfortable, kind of living my own life and having a circle of friends that consists to a fair degree of the people who are still here that I knew when I was growing up. Where my wife likes it here because she was able to dive into the community events and make friends that she could then introduce me to, even though it was my hometown. And the nature of the place itself, the geography, if you will, hasn't changed other than it's matured again from what when I was a kid were the leftover pastures and fields that had been abandoned after the Civil War and now have grown back to forest.
When I first got my job at the Historical Society more than 40 years ago, I rented an apartment in Keene for 1.5 years, and that was the longest I've ever been away from Stoddard as far as a living, as far as being a resident. But I wanted to go back, so when I married, we built a house on a piece of family property in Stoddard, and there we are, maintaining that family record of longevity in the town.
That's my story, I'm sticking to it.